Hello, shalom, and welcome to this episode of Congressional Conversations, where we discuss the priorities of New York's Jewish community with members of the New York Congressional Delegation. And I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. And today, hailing from the 14th Congressional District in the Bronx and in Queens, we welcome Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Representative Ocasio-Cortez serves on the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, the House Committee on Financial Services, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and the Congressional Progressive Caucus, among many other responsibilities that she has on Capitol Hill. Welcome, Congresswoman.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. It's really a pleasure to have you for this conversation. So let's talk beginning. We always have limited time on this program. So let's kind of dive into the first thing I like to ask my guests is a little bit more about their background. When did you decide to move into politics? What motivates you each day in your role as a congressional member? And as we all know, as a leader, if not the leader of the progressive movement?
Well, I think it's funny because I don't really feel like there was a moment where I decided that I was going to go into politics specifically. After I always knew, and I was always very passionate about community work. My parents raised me to be invested in community, dedicated in community. So service was always a big part of our lives growing up. And then after college, I decided that I wanted to come back to where my family was from, here in the Bronx. When I was a little girl, my parents, I was here in the Bronx, and my parents felt like they had to make choices because the way that schools were underinvested here in the Bronx. And so I decided when I graduated college that I wanted to move back here. I wanted to work on that issue and really dive into educational organizing. After the financial crisis, my family really dealt with the brunt of that. We almost lost our home. I started working in restaurants, and that's when the urgency of political issues and policymaking really revealed themselves to me. And, I didn't kind of one day wake up and decide that I was going to go into politics, but I feel like the path kind of was put in front of me in a way. One of the things that bonds us all together today is that I think we were raised in spiritual households, and sometimes you feel like the universe is just nudging you in a direction.
Right.
And, that's kind of what happened here. And I kind of looked around and I felt like, while we have wonderful elected officials across the board, I felt like we could do better in Congress. And so I decided to run. I didn't even run with an attachment to winning. I ran, well, you never run to lose. I didn't run thinking it was going to be a futile thing, but I ran, and for me, what I thought would be successful was that if we could have the first primary in our community, and first election really, in 14 years, we would be successful. And then if we actually were able to use that as an opportunity to talk about the policies and the priorities that are most important to us, then it would be a moment of service to the community. And we worked really, really hard, and we knocked on thousands of doors and had thousands of conversations. And I just feel very blessed and lucky enough that our community gave me a shot, and they sent me to Congress. And I certainly didn't think that it would have been the surprise and wave that really happened, but universe works in its own ways, and here we are today. And I'm really honored and thrilled to have played a role in any way, and to try to continue to play a role in advancing the causes of justice in the United States and around the world.
So it sounds like it's like a calling for you. You spoke about spiritual orientation. So when you wake up each morning and step into your role as Congresswoman of the 14th Congressional District, what is it that just truly motivates you? What's the stimulus that gets your blood going to get out there and to speak as passionately as you do on the issues you feel so strongly about?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head for me. I don't know. I guess it's strange because I think talking about having a sense of spirituality and calling when it comes to public service, I think it's been like a little taboo in a way, or we don't discuss it in how we normally, I don't know, as we do other sorts of motivations. But for me, it is a very deeply moral calling. It's a spiritually felt calling, and not even in like a dogmatic sense, but I just really feel a relationship to the world and to humanity. And so, so that very much drives my sense of purpose, and it drives my work. And you know, there's, like in so many other vocations and professions, that work can be very hard. It can be very taxing or stressful, but this is kind of what always recenters me. And so to me, it is very much a deeply moral pursuit, which is what informs our positions. You know, that is why I believe healthcare should be a human right. That's why I believe that we have a moral imperative to care for our earth and each other. And that's it. That really is it.
Very well. So let's pivot into some of the issues of concern to us, to all of us, but particularly to you as a lawmaker. When we met in the Bronx House on Pelham Parkway a bit more than a year ago, I saw you in action. First, very skillfully and warmly reading a book to Universal pre-K class. It was almost as if I sensed that you have been a teacher in the past, and then compassionately addressing a gathering of senior adults. Neither of those two activities are, especially with regard to the elderly, have taken place since the outbreak of the pandemic. So what must be done, Congresswoman, as COVID continues to ensure that our kids receive quality education and that our seniors get needed services and all families get access to basic needs like food security, healthcare, housing? There's so much where people are in need, particularly in the district that you represent.
Yeah, I mean, we have so much work to do, and we have a lot of work cut out for us. You know, as almost everybody knows by this point, we just recently passed the 1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan,
Yes.
which has a lot of critical resources to help fund school reopenings and making sure that we are able to invest in our communities to help bring some of that actual infrastructure, programming, organizational support together. So, you know, that addresses a lot of the logistical kind of needs and issues and resource needs and issues. But on a much more deeper level, we have a very Herculean task of restoring community and restoring a sense of fellowship. And I think that the two communities that you identify, you know, our children and our elders, have been some of the most deeply impacted by the isolation that has been required for us to contain the virus. And so on a community level, you know, I think one of the things that I'm really looking forward to is figuring out what we can do right here in our backyard to really support our elders in recovering from this time of isolation. You know, that too is a medical issue and has a medical cost. You know, we are starting to see some initial science and public science come out saying that isolation can be almost as taxing as smoking for people. And so I think it's really important that we see that and that we recognize that toll as much as we recognize the toll of, you know, having to check into the hospital or getting a vaccine or making sure that we have enough resources for COVID testing. And for our children, you know, school reopenings has been extremely important, but we're going to have to also do a lot to make sure that we're there for our kids too.
Yeah, well, when it comes to food insecurity, I know that you were down in Texas during their crisis with that for freezing cold episode that they had. I assume that similarly within your district, that's one of your priorities, is ensuring that food is available. Food insecurity right now, regrettably, has also become a priority.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what we were able to do in Texas was already modeled on a lot of the projects that we had actually collaborated with the Jewish Community Council of Pelham in helping. We have spent the last year working with JCC of Pelham to really fill up the food pantry and the food banks that we have there. And we've been doing that over the last year, and we've been able to get meals to thousands and thousands of people in our community. And so we started off small in our backyard. And if we hadn't done that work in Pelham, there's no way we would have been able to do that in Texas. There's a direct through line in what we learned in our work with JCC of Pelham, in what kind of community partners that we work with, because the Pelham Food Bank has been there for about 30 years. Yeah. And so you need to work with community leaders that have been deeply invested in the community, because that's where the trust is, that's where people know where to go. And so that informed a lot of the partners that we sought out in Texas. And so I'm happy to say that contribution is not just, what I've done. It's really what all of us did.
Yeah, and my colleague David Adelstein, who runs the JCC of Pelham Parkway, they do an excellent job. And particularly prior to Passover, there's such a pressing need in our Jewish community. And I'm sure the same thing is true prior to Easter. But all year round, this need is just so stark. Of ensuring that people have food to put in their mouths. Been lines I've seen prior to Thanksgiving, like around the corner, just to get a turkey, as an example. So we're speaking about pain. There are different kinds of pain, different sorts of pain. So we were deeply disturbed by the hatred and most particularly the anti-Semitism that was manifested, that was displayed on January 6th during the insurrection. And 1 year ago, on January 5th of 2020, you marched with us over the Brooklyn Bridge with JCRC, with UJA, to show your solidarity with the Jewish community. And we had suffered at that time, around Hanukkah time a year ago, a spate of violent and lethal anti-Semitic incidents in New York, mostly in Brooklyn, but all throughout the New York area and across the country, as the ADL has detailed. Considering the documented rise of hate in the country as a whole, and particularly now the focus on the hatred directed, really the heinous hatred directed towards the Asian American and Pacific Islander API community. What needs to be done about it, or what can a legislator like yourself do about it? How can our communities come together? You've spoken it on other issues, but in this issue in particular, to combat not only anti-Semitism against our Jewish community, but all other forms of hate as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is such an important question, because there are things that we can do. There are tangible things that we can do, both as legislators, but then all of us as a community. And this was actually one of the questions we had a town hall last night. And this was one of the questions that were fielded to us as well, because this is an issue that, when we talk about hatred, when we talk about bigotry, it can feel very overwhelming. It can feel very almost vague, like it's this big thing that exists, but it doesn't have, it's not like our issues with vaccines, where we can put money into production and, get a shot in people's arm. But there are a lot of things that we can do. So for example, early during the Trump administration, I remember when this was cut off, and I knew very early that this was going to translate into a lot of problems, which is that the federal government, we used to fund active and effective anti-hatred and de-escalation organizations and programs. And in fact, there was one of the most moving moments that I've witnessed in the House, in the Oversight Committee specifically, was we held a hearing on the rise of hatred, and after the Tree of Life shooting, after what we saw after what we saw with the Dylan Roof shooting in Black churches. I mean, there was just so much violence and hatred going up, and we actually had a de-radicalized former member of a neo-Nazi group who now works with these active kind of de-radicalization organizations, and it was called Life After Hate. And the federal government has historically supported a lot of these organizations because they are effective. They know how to actively de-escalate radicalized people and communities from violence. And early on in the Trump administration, that funding for that programming was cut, if not entirely, deeply significantly. And I do believe that we are starting to see some of the effects of that. But we also have to approach things from that prong, which is that addresses a lot of the radicalization that happens in person when people start meeting in person, et cetera. But we also have this modern emergence of digital radicalization. And on the other half of it, that's where it comes in. Another hearing that I had in financial services, which was the questioning of Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, because a lot of tech platforms, frankly, Facebook in particular, because other platforms are trying to rein it in and starting to understand how these social networks get mapped, and that there are actually technical aspects to radicalization. Facebook in particular has been an especially egregious actor, where they have algorithms that serve as actual recommendation engines to hate groups. And so this is something that is actually responsible for a large amount of radicalization, hatred, and creating these almost recommendation funnels towards violence. This is a digital problem, and we have the ability to fix it. And it opens up kind of a whole Pandora's box on other questions like antitrust, monopoly power, et cetera. But at its core, hatred and the radicalization that we are seeing is directly connected to digital platforms in general and Facebook in particular. And we really need to make sure that we focus and hold these CEOs responsible for the algorithms that they know, Michael, what they're doing. And the reason they're doing it is because that engagement, that metric keeps people on their platform longer, and they're able to monetize it more deeply. And so they know what they're doing. And we have the tools as legislators, especially in the United States Congress, to hold them responsible and get them to stop.
Wow. Yeah, that's so important. That's so crucial. As you and I both know, and so do our viewers, you're not born to hate. You learn how to hate. Within the framework of education, a study by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, the Claims Conference, released earlier this year, showed that a staggeringly small percentage of New Yorkers can even name a Nazi concentration camp or even know that 6 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. So how do we work together to ensure that comprehensive Holocaust education and deeper anti-hate education, as you were just describing, but we're looking at it now from a more pedagogical perspective, is provided in all schools?
Mm-hmm. This issue is so important. And the reason it's important is because it requires an understanding of how hatred works, how bigotry works, how white supremacy works. And also, there are aspects to this that I think are a specifically American and US problem. And the thing that ties bigotry, white supremacy, and some of the issues that we have in our country culturally together is this need to reinforce an idea of our collective innocence. And we see whether it's this historical amnesia around some of the most horrific injustices in human history, and particularly modern human history, whether it's the fact that, whether it's what you say, only 3% of New Yorkers being able to name a single concentration camp, whether it's undereducation about the Holocaust, whether it's the fact that we gloss over Japanese internment in the United States, whether it's our absolutely horrible education around slavery in the United States and Jim Crow, and the truth about what the civil rights movement really took in the United States. Educating about all of these things cuts directly against the myth of us always being the good guy in society, and the fact that we could have never have done any wrong. And that is a need for that's a need in kind of a white supremacist framework. It's a need in a bigoted framework. And it's a need that sometimes we just have in telling our own history. And it's the cost of it, I think it's really important that we also talk about the true cost of that, because it's not just, people don't know about history anymore, and this is such a shame. The cost of that is much deeper than that, because as we know, if we don't know our history, we are doomed to repeat it. And when we don't realize exactly the horrors that are possible, then we have people sometimes that make policy decisions that say, well, what's the worst that could happen? And I think that we really saw a lot of that in the last 4 years. Holocaust education is so deeply important. And I think what is so deeply important about Holocaust education, even my education, I went to public school. I went to public school in Yorktown Heights, and I'm very blessed to have grown up in a robust Jewish community there. But even then, our Holocaust education, a lot of it, if you're lucky enough to get it, is centered on the what happened.
Not the why.
But we need to have education about the why and the how. Mm-hmm. Because when you are educated about what happened without context, it's like, wow, that government must have been really evil. They just built this all up. And that's the thing. The moment where people say, how did all this happen anyway? Like, how did people just allow this, one of the greatest horrors of the 20th century, to just happen right under their nose? The fact that we even ask that question shows that we do not educate on our history in a way that gives people the tools to lead and be in community. Because I think that's one of the things that was so scary about the last 4 years, is that if you've studied this history, you should know how. And you should know that it begins with casual bigotry, that it begins with the increases of that, with the it's just a joke. And then it hits a certain critical volume where it starts to just turn into actual large-scale dehumanization and a dehumanized attitude towards Jewish communities, and now also, as we see, Asian communities, Black communities, et cetera. And once you hit that cultural dehumanization, that's when you start getting to actual laws that start to reinforce bigotry. And that's when you also start to see translations towards violence, both stochastic and just everyday people, and the increases of these violent incidents, and state-run and structural, like what we saw at the border. And so these things are all connected. But when only 3% of New Yorkers can name a single concentration camp during the Holocaust, that is why this amnesia is coinciding with this repeating cycle. And so it's really important that we teach our history. I'm proud to have co-sponsored legislation that does so with respect to Holocaust education, with respect to Asian and Pacific American education, and beyond in the United States.
Oh, thank you. I wish we had more time to delve into that. We'll try to find it, no doubt. But I just want to move on to another question, considering the limitations of time that we have. So you mentioned before about your growing up in Yorktown Heights and growing up in a vibrant Jewish community. There really has been a feeling to date, Congresswoman, that you haven't had much engagement with the organized Jewish community. Can you speak to your engagement with the Jewish community up to this point, and how you see your role as member of Congress with regard to Jewish issues? And I'm very glad that you mentioned before about the JCC in Pelham. But is there more to it than just that you can share with us, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm very proud to have been deeply engaged in our local community and our local Jewish community. From the very beginning, as you mentioned, we have been engaged at the Bronx House since the very beginning of our term, which is just such a phenomenal organization that goes so far to serve, as you mentioned, everybody from our universal pre-K to our seniors programs. The Jewish Center of Jackson Heights has been just such a deep, valued, and treasured partner that we've been involved with from the very beginning for a very long period of time. The Jewish Community Council of Pelham Parkway, we've been working, especially during COVID, to make sure that we collaborate with them and work on food distribution. We've met with rabbis, temples, and communities across the district, and I think that, and we've also met, additionally with other advocacy organizations, J Street, et cetera. And so, I think, as you mentioned, that feeling, I think a lot of us as communities, we all organize in different ways. And what I do want to say is that, I think when I first came in the House, especially with the crushing volume of everything that was going on at the time, I was really focused on our backyard in what drew in our the actual borders of our district. But communities all organize differently. And I believe that our Jewish community here in New York City, there's a lot of citywide organizations that perhaps we were saying, okay, listen, we need to focus on our immediate centers, in Pelham and Jackson Heights and City Island, et cetera. And we had to go to the citywide organizing for a little bit of another day so that we could focus on that backyard. So I think that's maybe where some of that feeling and sentiment had come from, but I'm very happy to be engaging now. And now that we have some time in this transition recovery out of COVID, to be able to do that citywide and statewide connecting as well. But I'm very proud of our Jewish communities here in the district and the way that they've shown up both for each other and also for the community at large. We have we have one of the most diverse communities in the world in Jackson Heights. Over 200 different languages and communities are represented there. And I'm very proud of our Jewish community for how they have organized and how they've also organized in partnership and collection with everyone else.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for responding to that question. Now let's deal with a prickly issue, the state of Israel. Israel is significant, as you know, to a vast majority of Jewish New Yorkers. We generally care a lot about Israel's welfare, its educational and social institutions, and its economy. We travel there, we have families there, greatly concerned over the safety of its people and the security of its borders. Ultimately, we seek an Israel at peace in the Middle East with its neighbors. The mainstream Jewish community supports the establishment of two states for two peoples as the most sustainable and achievable means of providing justice as well as human and democratic rights. Both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people have a right to self-determination. So what actions do you think can be taken to support movements towards peace, both between Israelis and Palestinians, as well as within the entire region, such as the Abraham Accords?
Yeah. So, earlier just now, you and I were talking about the what and the how.
Yes.
And I think that when we talk about establishing peace, centering people's humanities, protecting people's rights, it's not just about the what and the end goal, which often gets a lot of focus. But I actually think it's much more about the how and the way that we are coming together and how we interpret that what and how we act in the actions that we take to get to that what. And so what this really is about is that it's a question more than anything else about process. And so we really need to make sure that that we are valuing a process where all parties are respected and have a lot of equal opportunity to really make sure that we are negotiating good faith, et cetera. That being said, I think that there's just this one central issue of settlements, because if the what that has been decided on is two state, then the action of settlements it's not the how to get to that what. And so, I think that that's a central thing that we need to make sure that we center, and that we value Jewish and rather we value Israeli. We value the safety and the human rights of Israelis. We value the safety and the human rights of Palestinians in that process that is similar and that on equal footing. And so all of that is extremely important in that process. And I do believe that I know it may seem flowery, but and I know people have been saying this for generations, but it is what people need and it is what people want. And the centering and the value of human rights is really, I think, the path to peace here. We have to make sure, that we apply principles broadly across. And, I've done a lot of policy work in this space. And to me, it is important to apply these principles across. I don't believe that, just like here in the United States, I don't believe that children should be detained. I think that starting on those basic principles of human rights, I think we can build a path to peace together.
I hope so. And I would look forward offline for having further conversations with you in this regard. And hopefully this is just an opening towards having those more lengthy and more intense conversations. I just want to end with one additional question, as you being the author of the Green New Deal. As you may be aware, Israel is a leader in environmental sustainability, especially in water conservation, reforesting, and solar power. In fact, various sustainability projects around the world have been founded and supported by the Israeli organizations in the wakes of various natural disasters. I was in Barrio Real, Puerto Rico 2 years ago, and I saw the electricity-free sand water filtration system that was built by IsraAid, which is just incredible after the devastation wreaked by Hurricane Maria. So as the author of the GND, I understand it's called, might there be components of the Green New Deal in New York or around the world where Israeli ecological expertise could be employed to upscale real solutions and address the climate crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are systems that have emerged that are deeply inspiring about our hopes and prospects for the future. And to me, how I feel about especially scientific progress, not just in the field of climate science, but also overall, this applies to medical breakthroughs, et cetera, is that they are only as useful as much as they can be universally applied to help all of us. Because if we develop these scientific breakthroughs, like if we had a vaccine, for example, that was developed, but it was only available to just, small, slim sections of society, how great is that vaccine really? And so I think there's so much promise that has been released here. And I believe that Israel's technology around wastewater circulation, 90%, this is going to be so important for us to collaborate and work together, especially as water scarcity increases for vulnerable communities, both, yes, across the world, but also right here in the United States. We have had parts of our country already starting to experience droughts. And then on the other end, on the other side of that issue, flooding as well. And so I think that's really important. Israeli EV development has had a lot of promising technologies in how we actually power a lot of EVs. We got the sedans down, and now we need to get the Ford F-150s and some of these big guys. And so, EV powertrain technology that Israeli scientists have developed, as well as I think also from a policy perspective, the actual investment and in the policy investments and valuing of scientists is something that we really could inspire U.S. investment in how we treasure and value our scientists as well.
Right, 100% correct, and I'm very pleased that you see in Israel what we see in Israel in terms of its potential for being of value around the world, considering all of what it has done in the high-tech arena. Well, thank you so much, Representative Ocasio-Cortez, for spending so much time with me on this program. Is there a final thought that you'd like to share with our many viewers?
Yeah, first of all, I hope that we are reaching the end of our Zooms and that the next time we are together, it will be in person, in community. I anticipate that once things really start opening back up, that we will not take for granted our marches and our hugs again. And I'm really looking forward to continuing to engage and making sure that that this is just that we really engage in the community. And happy Passover,
Thank you very much, and a happy Easter to you and to our many viewers. Thank you very much for joining us on this program. And to learn more about some of the issues we discussed today, you can check out JCRC-NY's 2021 Focus on Communal Priorities on our website, jcrcny.org. And you can check out previous episodes of Congressional Conversations on our YouTube page. But more importantly is our thanks to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from the 14th Congressional District in New York for joining us and for sharing some of her views on the issues of the day, and hopefully will lead to even further and extensive conversations, mostly offline, but nonetheless further conversations. I'm very grateful. Thank you very much for joining us, and be well, everybody. Shalom and goodbye. Shalom.
Goodbye.